This presentation is on the promises and pitfalls of Drupal's cache system. My name is Kelly Lucas. I am lead digital architect at Pega Systems. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank the organizers for putting this camp together. And I want to thank everybody I've met in Poland who've been incredibly gracious and kind. It's been a great trip so far, and this is a great way to cap it off. I'm sure I'm going to feel really good at 2 o'clock, or 2:30. Maybe at 2 o'clock as well. So a little bit about Pega. We build and sell software for CRM, sales automation, and marketing. And it's all based on the Pega platform. The Pega platform actually has a lot in common with Drupal. It's essentially a system for building systems. It's a software for building software with a big UI component. At Pega, we use Drupal for all our external-facing websites and semi-external websites, and coming up also for our intranet, which will be moving off SharePoint, which we are all very excited to do. A little bit about me. I've been working with Drupal since version 6. That's been about 10 years, maybe a little more than 10 years. And I first learned about the Drupal 8 cache system from DrupalCon Los Angeles, in particular from watching presentations by Wim Leers and Fabian, who were among the architects of the Drupal 8 cache system and are basically geniuses. And the reason that I got excited about Drupal's cache system at the time was I was working on a client project, this was before I came to Pega, that was an intranet where a lot of the traffic, or all the traffic, was authenticated. So they were unable to take advantage of Drupal 7's cache system at the time. Over the last 2 years, we've been rebuilding all our Pega websites in Drupal 8. So I've had plenty of experience with both the promises and the pitfalls of the Drupal 8 cache system in that time. We've essentially been rebuilding the airplane while it was in the air. So I just want to start off by saying that I really think of all the things that Drupal 8 introduced over Drupal 7 and previous versions of Drupal, and that includes config management, Twig, and even some of the stuff coming up like Layout Builder and Workspaces, that I think the Drupal 8 cache system is one of the things that really sets Drupal apart in the CMS space. No other CMS, not WordPress, not Sitecore, has the kind of granular caching that's capable in Drupal, or the ability to invalidate caches in an intelligent way, both in Drupal itself and at a content delivery network. So I'm going to talk about the promises in some detail, but they include complete caching for anonymous users, dynamic page caching for authenticated users, component level caching for that helps with both of those systems, progressive page loading with Bigpipe, granular invalidation mechanisms, and again, strong support for content delivery networks. So it's probably obvious to everyone that caching is important. And why is caching important? It saves repeated work. There's no reason for Drupal to bootstrap and go through the process of processing a lot of PHP code, as well as making a lot of database queries for the same page that's exactly the same for everybody, or nearly the same for everybody. So in D7, there was the anonymous page cache, and it did have some integration with content delivery networks through modules like Purge, but the invalidation wasn't that smart. If you updated a node, Drupal knew to clear the cache for that node's canonical page, but it had no way of clearing the cache for any other page that might be dependent on that node, because there was a view or a block that referenced that node. And similarly, it had no way of communicating that change to a content delivery network. So with Drupal 8, we got granular invalidation and better CDN integration. So for instance, in this sort of theoretical sitemap, if I update image media 125, and that's like a main image on a blog post, which is then the thumbnail on a blog listing page, and then is referenced on a view on the home page, Drupal now knows that when I update image media 125 to invalidate the cache for the blog page, the blog listing page, and the home page. And it knows to do that not just in Drupal's own page cache, but it can also communicate, again with a module like Purge, to reverse proxies, content delivery network, or if you're on a host like Pantheon or Acquia to clear those of their Varnish caches. So the other big and exciting piece that was introduced in Drupal 8 was the dynamic page cache. And what the dynamic page cache allows Drupal to do is to cache most of the page for authenticated users. And then in a secondary step, in that lazy build step, inject the personalized or slow to render parts of the page. And then Bigpipe takes that a step further, where that page, most of that page that was cached can get sent to the browser immediately, and then through subsequent flushes, by keeping that connection open, using JavaScript commands, can inject the personalized bits right in the browser. And then the third big part of the Drupal 8 cache system was the introduction, and in some ways kind of the reintroduction of the render cache in Drupal. In Drupal 7, you had the block cache, and views had a sort of time-based ability to cache rendered content. But with Drupal 8, those rendered chunks became fully invalidatable and reusable. So render cache holds rendered chunks of content that can get reused across pages or responses. So if that's a block or a view that appears on multiple pages, instead of, even on cold caches for either the anonymous page cache or the dynamic page cache, the render cache can still be used to speed up the generation of those pages. And even the lazy build step, as we'll see in the video with Bigpipe, can leverage the render cache for slow to load but yet cacheable pieces of content. So what made this all possible in Drupal 8 was the introduction of the cacheability metadata concept and API. Perhaps most important of those concepts are the concept of cache tags. And what cache tags provide is a way for the system to tag any piece of that renderable content, whether it's an anonymous page, a dynamic page, or any piece of the render cache, and tag it with a dependency, essentially a data dependency, like node 123, media 456, user 789, saying that if any of those pieces of content or data change in the system, you should invalidate anything with these tags. The other part was the introduction of cache context, which define variants of things that can be cached. So for instance, the dynamic page cache, this would define the fact that you might have a variant of that page for different roles, roles being one of the most common contexts in Drupal, but language being another one that is pretty common. And that the last part is the introduction of cache max age. And cache max age is kind of, it's useful when you would prefer to use cache tags. You'd prefer to mark everything as cache permanent and then use cache tags to define how they get invalidated. But sometimes there's content that you don't have any visibility on. It's coming from an external system, and you just want it to be invalidated every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, because you don't have any insight into when it's going to change. Or it updates so frequently that it's not worth caching. It's not worth filling up your caches. So this slide is just meant to represent that the cacheability metadata bubbles up from the innermost rendered piece of content, for instance, in this case, maybe a piece of media, up through the node teaser, to a block, to the main content region, right up to the page. And so by the time the page is rendered, whether it's put into the anonymous page cache or for authenticated users into the dynamic page cache, it will have all the cache tags of everything inside of it. So I touched a little bit in that previous diagram on Bigpipe. This just sort of demonstrates that there's really two ways the lazy build system can work. One is Bigpipe and one is traditional. Traditional, Drupal grabs that cached page out of the dynamic page cache, injects all that content on the server side before sending it down to the browser. Whereas Bigpipe, it sends that cached page as soon as it can to the browser, and then it issues JavaScript commands through that open connection to replace the content in the browser. Let's see if this works. This is a video that you might have seen before. It was on Tweez's blog, and it demonstrates how that concept works. And I think it's just good not only for visualizing Bigpipe, but for visualizing the way the lazy build step works, even if you're using traditional single flush. So it's identified both cacheable and uncacheable parts of the page. You see the Bigpipe, you get some content almost immediately, so that time to first interaction is very quick. And then it loads the uncacheable parts later. And then on warm caches, you'll see that one block up over on the left, it appears immediately. It was cacheable but slow to cache, so on warm caches, it actually comes for most authenticated users right away. So I went quickly through the promises of the Drupal 8 cache system, partly because I'm sure a lot of you may already be familiar with it. And now I'm going to talk about some of the pitfalls. This is not comprehensive. This is based a lot on my own personal experience with the Drupal 8 cache system. But I think it's instructive, and I'll go over them in each one by one. So some of you may be familiar with this quote: there are only two hard things in computer science, cache invalidation and naming things. You may have also seen a variant of it. There are only two hard things in computer science, cache invalidation, naming things, and off by one errors. I bring up this quote because I want to make sure that everyone understands this is not at all a criticism of the Drupal 8 cache system. I think it's great. But that caching is hard. It's complicated. And it's particularly complicated in Drupal because Drupal isn't itself just a piece of software. Again, it's a piece of software for building other software. So it has, the Drupal 8 cache system has to anticipate, or tries to anticipate, how you would be building your website. And one area that Drupal 8 can't really anticipate is when you start getting into what I call advanced theming. Maybe some of you went to Salem's talk earlier on the design system that Pega uses. And I mentioned before how we were rebuilding our sites in Drupal 8. We were rebuilding the plane in the air. And in some ways, the design system was firing missiles at us while we were trying to build the site. Firing new patterns at us, new ways of integration, and we were really having to make things up as we went along. Which is great. I mean, the design system was awesome, but on the Drupal side, it was uncharted territory. And so we were doing things maybe not in such the Drupal way all the time, and maybe not in a completely consistent way all the time. But we did rely on the UI patterns module as a hook into the schema that Salem talked a lot about, and of course Twig, which was a godsend. So ultimately, the way I would describe our approach to the design system integration is server-side progressive decoupling. And as anyone who's, I think a lot of people who have done sort of more traditional decoupling with Drupal using a front-end framework and REST or GraphQL or JSON API, it's still early days, and you're still making up as you went along. So in the case of advanced theming, I think one easy example of where we ran into issues were with things like media. Because from a developer point of view, so actually let me move on to this next point, and that's that, you know, when you use Drupal as it's sort of meant to be used, through the block system, through entity display modes, and through views, the cache system usually it should just work. But as a developer integrating with a design system, the design system thinks of things in terms of like teaser cards or feature bands or bands. And when you have something like a media entity and a paragraph and a node, as a developer, you have to get creative in trying to take that data from that sort of structure and send it off to Twig in another structure. So media is a good example. Media are entities, they're cacheable, but as a developer and as a design system, all you really care about is the source of the image URL. And so when you use say a preprocess hook or an entity view build, sort of extract that data and wire it up to an external Twig template, you may run into issues like we did when that content gets cached in Drupal, and you don't necessarily, you're either not bubbling up the cache tags or you don't have access to that content in its raw form at all points in the render process. So that issue is probably fairly specific to us, but one thing that I think a lot of developers theming with Drupal will run into is just the decision to override a Twig template. In this case, this is a simple example of like an entity Twig template to decide what fields you want to pick and choose for your layout. You have very specific HTML requirements that you want to adhere to, and a view mode is either, or a display mode, either doesn't give you the flexibility you want or is frankly tedious to build for every different potential display of an entity. But the problem was, in this example, in this Twig template on the left, the way that the render system knows whether a cache or an entity has been rendered and that this cache tag should bubble up through the chain is by actually rendering the main content field here. And so what we've done on the right, and this example is straight off Stack Overflow, is you set a throwaway variable for that rendered content. And simply by passing that content variable to the render, the Twig render filter or function, that tells Drupal to bubble up the cache tag. So one area that I think maybe a lot of people aren't that aware of in Drupal 8 is the problem of invalidating views that have been cached in the Drupal 8 cache system. Drupal 8 ships with a cache tag called node_list, as well as taxonomy term _list, user _list, and that's added to any view of that type. So if you create a view of nodes, it gets that cache tag node list, and then that node, either that view or any page where that view is rendered gets put into the cache with that cache tag. Then if you update any node in the system, Drupal knows to invalidate that view. But think about that. If you save any node of any type in your system, it will invalidate all views of all types in your system. And that there's no intelligence there to know whether your node actually appears or could appear in that view. So what that leads to is a lot of unnecessary invalidation. In this case, in this theoretical sitemap, I've updated blog 3, and as I would expect, blogs and homepage get invalidated because they include a view of the node. But it also invalidates press releases, products, case studies, these landing pages with views of those types, which is both unnecessary and potentially expensive. Luckily, Contrib has a solution to this. One is the handy cache tags module, and that introduces some more focused cache tags by content type, so and vocabulary type. So, for instance, it would introduce a cache tag for node press release, or node event, or node product. And then, in addition to that, there's a module called Views Custom Cache Tags, which provides a UI when you're building your view to add custom cache tags like handy cache tag. So if you have a views-heavy site and a lot of different content types in particular, it's really worth considering updating your views so that they only get cleared when those types of nodes get saved. And with Views Custom Cache Tags, you can also fairly easily implement your own custom cache tags with a little bit of code. In this example, I want to tag my views with a cache tag that's specific to a node with a particular taxonomy term on it. Let's say it's a recipe site, and I only want this view to be updated when nodes of type vegetarian get cleared or get saved. And then it's fairly facile to create a node pre-save hook that only invalidates tags when of that category, or only invalidates views that have tags with that category. So one other issue that we ran into is we have a fair number of integrations with external systems in our Drupal 8 sites that in some cases will read from a feed and update content in Drupal from that feed. And originally we built those import mechanisms to essentially update content blindly. It would read from the feed, and then it would save all the nodes on the side. But what it didn't do is check to see whether that content had actually changed. And anytime you saved any content in Drupal, it would unnecessarily invalidate those pages. Those pages hadn't actually changed, but it was just grabbing the content from the external system and saving it. So a fairly straightforward way of or how we solved this was by taking a hash of that source data and saving it in Drupal with the content. And that way when we did our import and read that source data, like each individual chunk of the feed, if that hash hadn't changed, we wouldn't do, let's say, a node save on the other end. The migrate module actually has this built in, so that when you build a migration, and it's pretty easy to build recurring migrations, if you add that track changes flag to your migrate configuration, you can then run your recurring migration with drush mi update, and the migrate system will take care of all that hashing for you and will only update content that's changed in the source. So this was kind of an interesting one. We, speaking of not doing things the Drupal way, we had a user menu, a personalized user menu that was not added to the page through the block system. We had done things right, at least we thought we had. We had created the render array for that personalized menu with the right cache tags. We said it was the context was user, and it was dependent on this particular user. So Drupal knew that it wasn't cacheable. And that's a little hard to see, but what that that's just a response header that says X Drupal dynamic cache uncacheable. So that means it didn't even bother with the lazy build step. It just said, I can't even store this whole page in the dynamic page cache because this one bit isn't cacheable. So I just want to emphasize that the block system usually takes care of that for you. So if you create a block that's personalized and you place it on the page using the Drupal block system, or in the future using Layout Builder, because it uses the block derivative system, all that lazy builder stuff is built in. But in this case, we had to, because we were doing this through some hijinks, custom code, we actually had to add a lazy builder element to our render array that reference a callback that actually does the work of rendering that content. And then in addition with this create placeholder element, Drupal then knows, okay, I'm going to stick an element in the page that I'm going to put into the cache, and then in that lazy build step, I'm going to call this to actually inject the content. And because that element appeared on every page, that obviously increased the hit rate. Luckily, we found that issue pretty quickly. This is kind of an interesting one. We may be the last people in the world using the book module in Drupal. Does anybody know about this? Has anyone heard of the book module? Okay. It's actually it's useful for the sake of documentation, and this is used on our documentation site. But one thing to be aware of is not everything in Drupal core itself is even compliant with the cache system. And book navigation is one of those things. I guess the demand was just low. But it's also because it's tricky. The book navigation not only has to vary by every page in the book, because that's how Drupal knows where to expand the navigation and what to highlight. But it could potentially vary by user because different users will have different access to different parts of the book in theory. So the Drupal core they needed to ship, and they hadn't figured it out yet, or they hadn't done the work. So what we found out was that we had, at least in one case, an extremely large book, arguably too large, that had 4,000 pages on it. And that meant that when you rendered the navigation for that page, just the content of the page, the HTML page reached 2.7 megabytes, which is not good. And that meant 40 to 50 second initial load time. So the way that we solved that was, and actually the link here, and I posted copies of my slides. One of my colleagues at Isovera, Benji Fisher, he's also a big active in the community, wrote a blog post. He was the one that actually solved this for us. First, we replaced some classes that were doing the menu generation that were just optimized for our use case. We decided we didn't really care. We didn't really actually have a use case where some users had access to some part of the book and others didn't. Essentially, somebody usually had access or they didn't have access to the book. So we decided, well, we can cache that navigation once per book. And in terms of handling the active trail, in terms of what part of the navigation would be expanded, we offloaded that to the client side. So the results were now the page was Bigpipe eligible because previously they set this to max age 0, and didn't provide any sort of lazy builder callback, so these pages didn't even participate in the dynamic page cache. And then we got 2 to 3 second cache load times, which still not great because the page is still fairly large. But besides content changes, we've talked about offloading even more of the rendering to the client side, essentially doing more of an AJAX-style load of the page. And potentially pump priming so that this is generated when the node is saved, asynchronously, hopefully, but not when the first poor soul who comes to the page after the caches are cleared visits the page. So I talked a little bit about Bigpipe. This is just a small slide to mention that there are some infrastructure prerequisites and some prerequisites in terms of your code. Most importantly is your web server needs to support PHP output buffering or streaming, and that's where PHP will actually send out the rendered content that's in its buffer before it's all ready, or before it's finished being built. That's not necessarily the default in a lot of PHP setups. So if you're maintaining your own custom web servers, to look into that. And it really wasn't, we use Acquia. It wasn't until last summer that Acquia, who employs Wim Leers, supported Bigpipe. Similarly, your content delivery network or any of your reverse proxies also have to support that output buffering or streaming. And in terms of code, what we ran into were people were using, developers on our team, we're using Drupal JavaScript behaviors as sort of proxies for document on ready. And while behaviors do fire when document on ready is called in the browser, they also fire anytime new content is added to the DOM via Drupal's Ajax or JavaScript system, which is what Bigpipe does. Bigpipe adds new content to the DOM and therefore calls Drupal behaviors on that new content so that other modules can do things like add click events or whatever they want to do with JavaScript with that content. The problem with using it as a proxy for document on ready is that it was getting called every time Bigpipe injected stuff onto the page, meaning that multiple click events were being added to the same content twice, and maybe they weren't respecting the behavior's context. So just something to be aware of. So one thing that's kind of frustrating right now about not just the Drupal content cache, render cache, anonymous page cache system, but the whole cache bin system is there isn't a lot of tooling for giving you information about hit rate versus miss rate. I took a screenshot of our CDN dashboard we use Fastly. And something like this really isn't possible for measuring, your number of hits per second, misses per second, or your hit ratio against your anonymous page cache or your render cache. As far as I can tell, those PHP classes, the root services in Drupal, don't emit any information when there's a cache hit or a cache miss. So even logging that information is not possible at this point. But there was a D7 module for I believe it's for the anonymous page cache that did do something like that called Heisencache. Cache. And so one thing that would be great to see is some sort of tooling. And I think it would just be a matter of overriding those classes and adding that information to a log source. Actually building the visualizations is a little trickier, but if you're lucky enough to have something like Sumo or another logging platform, that becomes a much more real possibility. So I guess one other thing I'll mention is that without this data, you might not necessarily know whether it's worth your time to say implement views, custom cache tags, or handy cache tags, and update all your views to use targeted cache tags, which is frustrating. So I've covered the pitfalls that we ran into. I'd be curious to hear what other people have run into. But one thing I do want to bring up are some development and debugging tips that you can use with the Drupal 8 cache system. So as a developer, it's really important, at least at some point in your development process, to develop with caching enabled. Ironically, especially as it comes to things like advanced theming, that's when you are least likely to have caching enabled on your local system. But it's worth your while to, at least at one point in your development process, to turn that on and do a bit of testing. And in particular, test as different users and roles. One of the things that comes when you don't test as different users and roles, or one of the things that can happen, is something like an information disclosure hole. That's where you've cached something as one role, but if you haven't taken care to cache it with the right cache tags, people with different roles could end up seeing that. And that's a security issue. At worst case scenario, it's just embarrassing for you and for your clients. You can, in your development services YAML, enable cache tag headers, and that will output some really useful information, like the cache tags that bubbled up to the response, or the cache context that bubbled up to the response, and the cache tags that bubbled up to the response. So if you're trying to debug like what piece of content or why this page is or is not being cached, that information is helpful. And then there's a contrib module, the developer module called Enderbys, that allows you to actually visualize that that information. So like in the developer console, you can say, show me all the parts of the page with cache, cache tag node : 123. And then it'll highlight the parts of the page. And it'll highlight the parts of the page that are not cacheable and that are injected in the lazy build process. It's cool. It's an alpha version, but it's just a developer module, so I encourage people to take a look at it. So in conclusion, the Drupal 8 cache system is a powerful feature and a key value proposition for Drupal 8. But sidestepping the guardrails can lead to unexpected results. And again, advanced theming is one of those areas that we ran into that caused that. And when it comes to lists and views, site developers and builders need to be proactive about managing the cache tags on views, especially if it's a views-heavy site, where there are a lot of different content types that are updated frequently. And lastly, and this is really a message that I'm sure I think most of the people in the room probably understand this, but business people probably need to understand that tuning takes work, and in particular maintenance over time. It takes monitoring, and it takes a budget. Because once your site goes out into the wild, for a lot of us, especially on short timelines, that's the first time your site really gets load tested under real world conditions. So the Drupal 8 cache system, what's next? JSON API is going into core. REST is already in core. They both take advantage of the cacheability metadata in the case of JSON API, does some fragment caching, and they can both use that information to invalidate and to cache responses coming out of your API. And I think you could take that a step further. I've seen some decoupled implementations where there's an intermediate storage layer between Drupal and maybe your React or your Angular front end. And using something like cache tags and something similar to the Purge module, you could actually proactively essentially cache stuff at that intermediate layer, but also invalidate it intelligently. Kind of similar to that is we've been really excited about things like Gatsby for static site generation. And I know Gatsby is working on the ability to regenerate a site partially through partial site regenerations. I believe right now you have to regenerate the site basically every time. So it'd be kind of cool to see an implementation of this cacheability metadata that triggers a partial regeneration of the site in Gatsby. That way you get the best of both worlds. You would get the speed that you get from a static site, but you'd also get the quick updates that content authors and editors really expect when they're using Drupal. They want to see their content in production as soon as they hit save. So this slide is just a bunch of resources. I definitely recommend Wimlear's blog and any presentation he's made over the past couple of years at DrupalCon. I posted my slides at this link, bit.ly d8-cache. Feel free to reach out to me on Drupal.org, where I'm krlucas, via email, or I'm krlucas@gmail, or my work address at kelly.lucas@pega.com. And thank you, everyone, for showing up. I think we have plenty of time for questions. So if there are any questions, I'm glad to take them. It's the missile shooter.
Great presentation, Kelly.
Thanks, Salem.
So as one of the people behind the advanced theming at Pega, what can be done from a front-end developer or even just Drupal themer point of view to better support the caching system and sort of balance out the things that Drupal expects should happen while still keeping the modern code base. As far as just like best practices or better ways to test so that we don't less pitfalls, more positive.
Sure. Well, yeah. We could have just built it all. We could have built both as a Drupal base theme. But then we would have been giving up all the modern stuff that both provides, like sort of modern handling of web components and things like that. So we made that strategic trade-off because we wanted to use web components. We wanted to use modern JavaScript techniques. Again, I think the only thing I can emphasize there is that if you just stick with sort of your regular theme, you're using Bootstrap, you're doing a sub-theme out of Bootstrap or out of Zen, and you stick to things like always using display modes or leveraging them as much as you can, you probably won't run into these problems. But when you get creative, and I think this would affect a sort of standard decoupled setup like where you're using React and JSON API, that there really isn't, you're reinventing the wheel. I mean, a lot of the decoupled scenarios now, I think there's standards kind of coming into vogue, but
it's still relatively new territory.
Yeah.
I'm sort of figuring it out. Yeah.
So if you're going to go, all I can say is be aware of the Drupal 8 cache system. If you're going to go off the range and do your own thing and create your own, essentially your own render system. If I had more time and more money and more budget, I think we would have made a much more conscious sort of framework for integrating Drupal with, in particular, both.
Maybe next version.
Yeah, maybe. Any other questions? Has anybody else run into any problems with the Drupal 8 cache system that they'd like to share? That was one of my favorite parts of the DrupalCamp presentation, was people coming up to me afterwards and being like, we ran into this and this and this. All right. Well, great. Well, thanks, everybody. And thanks.